Okay. All right, we're ready to roll. Okay, so this is essentially the last section here of the chapter. All right, so on Thursday, we were talking about essentially kind of I did historical cliff notes basically on how we as a country became independent, right? And so we had discussed the French and Indian War, how that played a role in the kind of movement for initially essentially representation from the American colonists, and the issue. What were the American colonists like initially kind of upset about that Great Britain was doing?
The taxation.
Yeah, the whole issue of taxes, right? So you had things like the Stamp Act, which basically was kind of just kind of a seal the British government put on anything that was related to like kind of documents or paper products and stuff like that. The Tea Act and that to try to basically ensure that the British East India Company was able to get a kind of corner of the market on tea, which was a popular beverage for British subjects, right? And so the whole issue like that, you probably heard when the last time you took kind of your Constitution test, what, 7th grade or something like that, was the whole idea of taxation without representation. The idea that basically the American colonists who were British subjects didn't get a vote on these taxes, all right? And so we have a kind of this kind of call for basically initially kind of being included in the process to one in which colonists advocated for complete separation from Great Britain, right? Which we take for granted, but we were the first kind of country to do so in what they classified the New World, right? And so through the kind of Declaration of Independence, we outlined our kind of goals here, right? Which again, we talked about in chapter 1, ideals, values and stuff. Some of that stuff is kind of related into the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, stuff like that. All right, and like I was telling you, a lot of those guys that signed the Declaration of Independence, if things would have changed, turned out differently with the American Revolution, those guys would be minor footnotes in history. All right, they would have been probably hung for treason, all right, for the most part. So with the kind of after the Battle of Yorktown is generally viewed as the kind of final battle of the American Revolution, all right, and a little bit before that, the colonists decided to kind of organize a government. Now, what did they call the first government that we had? Articles of Confederation, right? Okay, Confederation is kind of a loose association here. So what this was basically kind of the original 13 states, which were the 13 colonies, kind of acting as almost, in a sense, independent countries into themselves, all right? I gave you guys that article yesterday. What were some of the problems with the Articles of Confederation? Like when it came to, let's say, like branches of government. How many branches of government were in the Articles of Confederation? 1. Yeah, it was basically Congress. All right, so there was no executive branch particularly because probably the reaction is we just came out of a concept of a monarchy. All right, so we kind of went from like one extreme to the other. All right, so that can create some problems. All right, also too with the states could issue their own what? Money, yeah, currency. So it got kind of confusing. Like how much was a New York dollar compared to a kind of Virginia dollar? All right. With the issue of taxes, right? Basically the states didn't necessarily have to. It was kind of like, hey, to recommend it to basically give to the federal government. All right. And so it's just gonna be human nature. People are basically, if you're not forced to pay something, you're probably not going to pay it, right? All right. And so there's a number of issues there where this happens with a lot of young countries. All right, with independence, while at the time is basically there's like an exuberance with that. The actual kind of business of governing can be somewhat difficult, right? So what we see here is there's a number of issues that come up that kind of basically kind of like the framers, a lot of the guys who signed the Declaration of Independence, kind of understood probably needed to be changed. All right, so there's a couple of incidents. One incident in which, and then geographically speaking, this is what the United States was after the American Revolution. We were basically kind of the original 13 colonies, all right, stretching from New Hampshire. Maine was actually part of Massachusetts at the time, all the way down to Georgia. Now, the deal is a lot of these states here, not everybody, there's different agendas for different states. we're starting to see basically kind of economies differ here. While still the United States is still primarily an agrarian economy, meaning farming is the main economic engine here, we start to see more kind of industry kind of developing in the northern states. The southern states depend heavily upon farming, in particular the cash crop of cotton, right? This here in green, like we see where Illinois is, this later becomes an issue here because essentially what the states did, all right, was essentially just basically extended their borders, all right, west. And at one point, Illinois was basically kind of like part of initially New York, and then it became part of Virginia. But the claims were very confusing still, all right? So we run into some problems here. That's stuff that needs to be worked out, all right? One incident, though, kind of highlights some of the problems with not having maybe a strong kind of central government here, all right? And this happens in Massachusetts. It's popularly referred to as Shays' Rebellion, named after a guy named Daniel Shay, who was one of the heads of it. But there's basically 4 of these guys that led this. Now, these are basically guys who are veterans of the American Revolution. Like Daniel Shay fought like at Concord and Lexington. And so these are guys that are kind of felt as farmers, and they were essentially, that was their job as farmers. They felt that there was a kind of unfair taxation here. And again, the states were able to tax, all right, to generate revenue. And this is where it's all well and good. You could rally saying, no taxation without representation, all right? But for a government to function at some level, it has to have taxes, all right? If you're going to provide services, at some point you're going to have taxes. So there was a tax, and also a number of these guys felt that they weren't given the kind of proper pensions, all right, which also requires taxation for their participation in the American Revolution. All right, so this rebellion, which started in August of 1786, kind of lasted into February of 1787. All right, at the end of it, the ringleaders basically they were able to kind of make a kind of an agreement with the state of Massachusetts because they actually tried to take over an armory in Springfield. All right, so they're looking to take guns and stuff. And a number of tax collectors that came through, they were attacked by these guys. All right. The 4 ringleaders were actually given basically kind of an agreement, and they were allowed to basically kind of Daniel Shay basically retired on a pension. But there were 6 people who died in the violence. 2 of them were hung for looting. All right. But what this does is this highlights that there's no kind of, we don't have a standing army like we have today. All right. This issue of basically kind of and Thomas Jefferson said when he was in France when this happened, said that rebellion is just kind of like it's necessary at times for democracy. All right. But there was other people who felt like these things are going to happen more frequently, and that this should we need to find a way to kind of counteract these things. All right. So there's a little bit of, there's a little bit of tension here between those guys who were like kind of the founding fathers. There's people like Jefferson who have kind of saw that this is just kind of a byproduct of basically being a kind of a newly free country, where other people felt like we're not going to be able to kind of maintain our status as an independent nation because Great Britain is hanging out in Canada at this time. The British are essentially kind of expecting us to trip up and fail, right? And so this here is a kind of an unflattering image of the 2 main ringleaders, Daniel Shay and a guy named Joe Shattuck. All right, but they survived the rebellion. Like I said, they were able to kind of work on a deal with the government. All right, but a month into the kind of rebellion, this kind of image here of a famous incident that occurred here in Springfield, Massachusetts. A month into the rebellion, there was a number of kind of delegates, so many of them who were at the Declaration of Independence, who met in Maryland, in Annapolis, to basically kind of discuss what to do about incidents like Shays' Rebellion. All right. Now, the Annapolis Convention was very limited. It had 12 delegates from 5 states. I believe it was New Jersey, New York, I want to say Massachusetts, and Virginia, I know was there, all right? But what this ended up happening was that basically kind of, there's this idea of these kind of, one of the factors here we have this issue of kind of protectionist kind of tariffs, right? A tariff is basically a tax on imported goods, right? And so some of these states were issuing tariffs against one another, all right? And so this created a little bit of problem of trade within the 13 states, all right? And that kind of goes with the fact that each state kind of had its own currency. So they met in Annapolis. Like I said, it was a month into Shays' Rebellion. While this was initially trying to discuss this whole issue of kind of economics, Shays' Rebellion kind of hung over the delegation here, and they met at a tavern. This isn't like a big hall or whatever like that, all right? And so what they decided, though, was that they needed to basically have a larger meeting to discuss maybe kind of changing and revising the Articles of Confederation, all right? Now, what ends up happening is that they basically kind of scrap the whole kind of concept of the Articles of Confederation. And that leads to, in the next year, in May into the summer, into like early, kind of like the kind of part of September, what we refer to as the Constitutional Convention. All right, so this met in Philadelphia, and this was larger, right? You had all the states sent delegations except, I believe, Rhode Island. All right, Rhode Island being the smallest state was essentially kind of cool with the whole situation. All right. And so what they were basically, they met, this wasn't public, all right, because you can see that if they let the public know that they were basically kind of tweaking this, it could create a little bit of chaos, all right? People could start to, basically kind of doubt the kind of the federal government at this time. And so they basically kind of like kept this relatively secret, although a lot of people there's some people that knew, all right? This was particularly like the hottest summer, one of the hottest summers in Philadelphia. All right, and so these guys are meeting in relative secret to try to basically initially tweak the Articles of Confederation, but after they get in through and they kind of see that not everybody's kind of agreeing here, that there's a number of problems, that they just essentially kind of scrap the whole thing. That they definitely try to keep secret, because that would have kind of definitely created some chaos here. All right, so the convention, kind of famously here in Philadelphia. All right, Independence Hall, right? They refer to it. This is a kind of let's see, let me go back there. So the principles that are going to influence these delegates here to the Constitutional Convention, they're just not creating something completely out of nothing here. They're going to use history. They're going to use the fact that kind of we are essentially kind of a colony of Great Britain. We're going to use a lot of ideas that British government kind of had. One, the idea of something that was signed in 1215 by King John under duress, right, if you will. It's called the Magna Carta, meaning the Great Charter. Right. This was signed in 1215 after King John lost a lot of territory in France that the British Crown, the English Crown had owned. This was before technically Great Britain. All right, and within the Magna Carta, there is that concept of no taxation without representation. All right, but the idea of rule of law, that essentially, like, the King of England was not necessarily above the law, was the idea with this. All right, now in reality, the Magna Carta wasn't always carried out to the T by the English Crown, but it did set what we call precedent because it was written down. All right. Within that, we also have this concept we got from Great Britain of what we call bicameralism, which basically means two houses. All right. In England, what they had, starting with what they call the model parliament, you had the House of Lords and the House of Commons. All right. Parliament was the lawmaking body of Great Britain. All right. As time went on, the House of Commons became the more important house and basically kind of decision-making process there. All right, so this was an issue that the founding fathers thought that this was a good thing to kind of replicate, if you will. But this kind of creates an issue here on what we say who should be represented. All right, so our concept of Congress, and that comes from kind of the British kind of tradition here. Another kind of older document that was in the 17th century was the English Bill of Rights, and we'll talk about what the Bill of Rights are later. And so, Bill of Rights here, in this sense, with this in 1689, was basically established freedoms such as kind of freedom of taxation without representation, where you see that again, which was kind of reiterated from the Magna Carta. Freedom from cruel and unusual punishment. Right, we're going to see this kind of placed into our own Bill of Rights with one of the amendments. And then a big one, which is something that still is somewhat controversial today, the right to bear arms. All right, so this was something that, and again, the whole idea here with the Second Amendment, it was basically kind of written in the 18th century. The types of guns that were used, and they were a little bit different. So we still kind of run into kind of like some controversy with this. But that idea that later we're going to add to the Constitution has its origins in kind of English law to a certain extent. All right. And then the fourth one was a greater kind of idea that had essentially kind of what had been popularized in Europe called the Enlightenment. And so the Enlightenment was this idea that emerges in the 1700s, which kind of questions the whole concept of what we call the divine right of kings. All right. One of the guys that kind of like influential, one of the kind of enlightened philosophers is the English philosopher John Locke. Like it says, who argue that government exists only by the consent of the people. All right. And so the Enlightenment is going to also be influential in something later like the French Revolution. All right. And so this was this idea that, this kind of challenged the whole idea that kings, like in England and France and stuff like that, that their power is vested from some kind of divinely inspired intervention. Here, that this kind of argued that human beings, man, if you will, is rational, all right, and should be able to make kind of their own decisions, all right. This is highly influential when we get into the concept of kind of like representative democracy. All right, so these were kind of ideas that the founders kind of looked towards when they started kind of creating this new government. All right, and so there's my man John Locke. He's got a nice mullet there. All right, so what ends up happening, like I said, the debating here is held in secret. 55 delegates from 12 states, like I said, Rhode Island refused to attend. All right, to try to kind of maintain order here, they needed to kind of have somebody who could kind of dictate because things got heated, kind of dictate, try to kind of create this kind of sense of kind of cohesion here. And so they unanimously selected George Washington, who was from the Virginia delegation. All right. Now, why do you think they picked Washington? Because he was the general from the American Revolution. All right. And, essentially Washington, after the American Revolution, retired to Mount Vernon, to his estate in Mount Vernon. All right. So he's asked to kind of come back and kind of serve in this kind. So a lot of there's a famous painting in which shows here, like this one right here, which shows kind of Washington standing there. It's been kind of idolized in that. I believe this is in the Smithsonian. All right, and so he has this presence here that kind of allows for to kind of those to get into heated debates. He can essentially kind of steer it. Kind of keep them calm, if you will. All right. And so what we see here is that while Washington is considered the president, if you will, of the convention, all right, the guy that we kind of considered the father of the Constitution is James Madison, because Madison kept a detailed diary. So a lot of the stuff that we know that happened at the convention comes from Madison's words. All right. And so Madison was a big advocate for a stronger, what we call central federal government. All right. And so this basically kind of was, like I said, these are the primary sources that we get from the convention, because we didn't have there was no journalists covering this, because this was held primarily in secret. All right. So a lot of times they refer to Madison as the father of the Constitution. Mainly that's because he kind of kept detailed notes about what went down. There he is, right behind the Constitution. All right. Now, what essentially Madison is advocating for is this concept of federalism, all right, where we see a federal or central government kind of sharing power between the states. And so we use the term federal, we're talking national. All right, that's the government that today is based in D.C. All right, D.C. is not the capital yet. And so there's this idea that the states here, under the Articles of Confederation, had more power, all right, than the federal government. Here, the attempt is to kind of balance the scales a bit, so the country, the nation, can remain a kind of independent country, if you will. All right, and so there's always, and still to this day, there's always this issue, kind of, where kind of like, this concept of states' rights, where states, kind of what we call jurisdiction, is established. All right, now, let me make sure I got this. Yeah, now a big part of the convention here. Not everybody, like I said, not everybody's on the same page. All right, the delegation from Massachusetts has different agenda than, say, the delegation from Virginia or South Carolina. All right. And so there was something that needed to, basically, and there's according to Madison, there were some moments where this was going to fall apart. This was kind of the issue was pretty contentious at times. All right. So what they needed to do was kind of give and take a little bit. This is something that's kind of lacking in our kind of current political situation. This concept of compromise, all right, which basically you each side kind of gives a little, if you will. All right. This requires a lot of debate. All right. Now the two big issues that were being kind of compromised here was how do we get kind of representation in Congress in the legislative branch, and basically the issue of slavery. All right, which is constantly going to be compromised in various forms up until the Civil War. All right, so the big compromise here is like, how do we've determined that we're going to have two houses of Congress. All right, now how do we base who gets representation in Congress? There was a number of states who, like Virginia or New York, more populated states, who believed in the fact that because they had more population, they should have more representation in the federal government. There was other smaller states, New Jersey, Connecticut, that were basically afraid that they would be kind of lost in the shuffle. All right. So we start to see this kind of development between large states and small states, if you will. All right. And so the first plan that was kind of set out in the convention was something referred to as the Virginia Plan. All right. Named in such because the guy who kind of presented this, Edmund Randolph, was a delegate from Virginia. All right. Now, what the Virginia Plan advocates is a bicameral legislature, two-house legislature, with both houses based on representation based on population. So what that means, the larger your state's population, all right, the more reps you have in the Senate and the House of Representatives. All right. So obviously the larger states with larger populations are going to be for this. Smaller states, absolutely not. All right, because this is essentially going to be kind of like a threat to their ability to be to kind of have a seat at the table, so to speak. All right. Now, these are kind of like some diagrams here that are too complicated to really kind of understand, but I kind of simplified it, if you will. All right. And this is a copy of the Virginia Plan, all right, that they kind of presented at the convention. Now, the small state plan was called the New Jersey Plan. All right. Named so because the guy who presented that plan, William Patterson, was a delegate from New Jersey. All right. Now, what Patterson was advocating was like, you know what? We don't have to have two houses of legislature. All right. We just have one. Right. The argument in reality, while Great Britain technically had two, the House of Commons was really the one that was doing most of the work. Right. The House of Lords was basically based on people who had the titles like Duke and stuff like that. All right. So this called for a one-house legislature with equal representation. All right. Mainly initially advocating for one representative for each state. All right. So you have 13. You'd have basically a legislature of 13 members there. All right. Also giving more power to states to levy and collect taxes, kind of like similar to what they had in the Articles of Confederation. All right. So this again benefited states with smaller populations. So we start this almost kind of the whole thing almost broke down over this, and then you had other an addition here. I'll keep it going. That was kind of thrown in that wasn't really never really caught on. That was referred to later as the British Plan. All right. Now this was proposed by Alexander Hamilton, the famous guy from the play Hamilton. Right. So what Hamilton called for kind of took from the Virginia Plan, bicameral legislature, two houses. All right. Lower house, which would be like the House of Representatives, would be elected by the people. All right. Upper house elected by electors chosen by the people. And the big thing here, and that's what we had for a while for there was the Senate. But the big thing here is that these people in the upper house would serve for life. Now, he also advocated for a strong executive, right? That would almost kind of resemble a king to a certain extent. Right, so that's why often they refer to it as the British Plan. This didn't really kind of catch on too much. All right, this, like I said, was a little bit too similar to what we had just gotten out of. All right, but the issue here was basically kind of like we have a lower house elected by the people, upper house elected by electors, was a plan that was essentially for a long time, U.S. senators weren't directly elected by the people. They were elected by state legislatures for a while there. All right, so these are the three plans, but they're really the two plans that are being kind of hashed out are the Virginia and New Jersey Plan. All right. And then eventually we do find a compromise here. All right. That is often referred to as the Great Compromise, and that's the Connecticut Plan. All right. This is named so after the delegate from the state of Connecticut, Roger Sherman. So, but basically what this is, it basically calls for a bicameral legislature. Upper house based on equal representation. That's the Senate. And today we have basically every state has 2 senators. And then, and then the lower house based on population. That's the House of Representatives. All right. Now, like today, when we have like states like California and like, New York have more delegates than, let's say, states like Wyoming. All right. So also this is going to relate to how many representatives and senators that you have is really how much, like when we talk about later, talk about the electoral college, how many kind of electoral delegates you have for president. All right. So this is essentially kind of, like I said, often referred to as the Great Compromise. All right. So they handle the issue, if you will, of essentially kind of representation, but how we count people in representation, like how do we count people? Like how do we get a count of like who's in census, right? So this year's a census, right? Yeah, we count in here. It's pretty easy, right? However, there was an issue here, and which we'll talk about on Thursday, in which how not everybody's going to be counted. All right, you have basically individuals who, in many cases, are basically considered property, and that's slaves. All right, and so how we count slaves towards this and the issue of kind of representation is the next compromise that I said is essentially kind of, in many cases, this is going to be kind of multiply kind of compromised throughout history. All right, up until the Civil War. Okay, so that was the last slide, right?
Yes.
Okay, all right. So I'll cover that on Thursday. Those of you guys at home, I'm going to stop recording later.